Some Old Testament stories read like the script of an action movie. First Samuel 19 through 30, for instance, recounts the adventures of David as he's pursued by King Saul and his troops in the wilderness. I mean, it's almost like Robin Hood. He narrowly escapes capture time and again. He even had opportunities to strike Saul down, but he heroically refused. Now, most of us will never have experiences like David's, and his responses sometimes seem almost superhuman. So we might be tempted to think that these stories are just entertaining accounts, that maybe they're just fictional. But when we turn over to the book of Psalms, we find several prayers from this time period in David's life. And I think they reveal that he's not just some shallow, swashbuckling sort of character. He had emotional struggles like many of us, and he processed those feelings by bringing them before the Lord in prayer. And so, though our hard times are different from David's, these Psalms still help us learn how to pray in hard times. They show us how a vital relationship with God can change our perception of our circumstances. And so we turn now to Psalm 54, where the superscript introduces the psalm by saying this: "To the choir master, with stringed instruments, a maskil of David, when the Ziphites went and told Saul, is not David hiding among us?" Now, as we learned previously, a maskil is a song that's designed to teach, to impart wisdom. And so in this case, David says that he wrote it for stringed instruments. He was known for his skill in playing the lyre, which is like a small harp-shaped sort of instrument. And as a young man, he even served in Saul's royal court as a musician. And so his arrangement of this psalm might have featured the lyre, maybe larger harps, even lutes, sort of guitar-like instruments. But unfortunately, we have no account of that accompaniment to know for sure. Now, the song captures David's response to this whole situation with the Ziphites. The town of Ziph was located in Judah's tribal allotment. That was the southern part of the land. And so Ziph was located about 40 miles south of the town that David grew up in, Bethlehem. So these people were extended relatives of David, but we don't know whether he actually knew any of them. We'll talk about that more in a minute. Apparently, the Ziphites did not value their tribal connection with David. They voluntarily reported his location to Saul on 2 locations. The first one is recorded for us in 1 Samuel 23. Saul and his men were closing in on David. They were racing along on opposite sides of a mountain. And David only escaped because Saul had to turn back when he received word of a Philistine attack further north. The other encounter is recorded for us in 1 Samuel 26. The Ziphites again went to Saul and told him that David was in the area. And so Saul and his men set up camp to systematically hunt down David. And what happened was, great story, David was able to sneak into their encampment in the dark of night. And he came right up to Saul and could have killed him on the spot. Saul's spear was right there. And so what he did instead was he took Saul's spear and his jar of water, snuck off, and when he was some distance away, calls back to the camp, wakes everybody up to show them how vulnerable they were and how loyal he remained to King Saul in spite of his hostility. So you can imagine David must have been very frustrated with these people in Ziph. So in Psalm 54, he gives us an example of how to pray when we're threatened. Now, subsequent Psalms, we'll see, address more of the complex emotions that arise in such situations. But Psalm 54 just starts us off. It lays the groundwork with 3 basic steps to follow in response to personal threat, to those feelings that you're threatened. Now again, you and I will probably never flee from the armies of a jealous king. But we do feel threatened by various situations that we encounter in our personal relationships and even in society at a large. Maybe you even felt that way this week. Now, the potential harm could be physical, but it could also be things that we fear would harm us emotionally or just society as a whole or financially. And on top of that, we all face the spiritual threat that's mentioned in 1 Peter 5:8. Peter says, "Be sober-minded, be watchful. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour." So Psalm 54 shows us the basic steps to follow in all of those situations. The first step is to ask God for help. It used to be difficult to call for help in the days before mobile phones. In the first year after my wife and I were married, I had an hour commute to work that took me straight through downtown Los Angeles. And one hot summer day, I was on my way home, and the timing belt on our little Ford Escort snapped, and the engine stopped. I was able to coast off a nearby exit into a neighborhood that was honestly kind of rough. I mean, I was clearly out of place there, and there were no payphones anywhere in sight. I tried asking someone, but the person did not seem to speak English, and I had to wander a few blocks before I finally found this old grungy payphone. And then, of course, I had to wait on hold as I tried to arrange for a tow truck to come. And of course, it finally did, and I made it safely home to my loving wife. But rightly or wrongly, I felt threatened by that situation. Now, a mobile phone would have been helpful back then, but I mean, even with our phones, you can still find yourself in a dead zone without any signal. But God is always near, and He always hears. Now, of course, He's not in the car towing business, but He's sovereign over the circumstances of our lives. And so when we feel threatened, we should pray to Him, but we often fail to do so. We try to manage the situation in our own wisdom and strength. And so our first step should always be to ask for God's help. David began this way as he responded to the Ziphites and to Saul. In Psalm 54, verse 1, he said this, "O God, save me by your name and vindicate me by your might." Now, David had already shown himself to be a brilliant military commander. That's why Saul was jealous about him. And he had been hiding out in this area for a little while. He undoubtedly knew the lay of the land. He had experienced fighting men with him. They were probably outnumbered by Saul's troops, but they had overcome the odds before. David could have relied entirely on his own skills. But he knew and believed that God was his only hope. And so he prayed, "Save me by your name." Now, he's not using some kind of magical incantation here. God's name expresses who He is. It's the sum of His character. And so the idea is that David wanted God to help him so that others would see who God is, what He's like. It was not all about David's personal feelings. He was asking God to work for His own glory. He was linking his circumstances, his situation, to God's overarching plan of making His glory known throughout the earth. Now, we find that same sort of thinking elsewhere in Scripture. Earlier in the Old Testament, in Exodus 32, it tells us about how the Israelites sinned by making a golden calf while Moses was away receiving God's commandments upon Mount Sinai. And God threatened to destroy them. But Moses pleaded with the Lord on the basis of what would the Egyptians think if after saving His people, bringing them through the Red Sea and all of those things, if He just simply destroyed them. See, Moses prayed on the basis of God's glory, His reputation, His fame. And we see something similar over in the New Testament. In John 14, verse 13, it tells us that Jesus taught His disciples, "Whatever you ask in my name, This I will do, catch this, that the Father may be glorified in the Son. So we need to relate all our prayers to the name and the glory, the purpose of God. Now, David also prayed there in the next line for vindication by God's might. The idea is he had done nothing to deserve such treatment from Saul or from the Ziphites. He was innocent, and so he asked God to intervene, to bring justice. He believed that God in his mighty power was fully able to do so. Now, he continued his prayer in verse 2 by saying, "O God, hear my prayer. Give ear to the words of my mouth." Now, he's not doubting that God would listen to him or hear him. These words express David's desperation. He was fully relying upon God. He believed that prayer was the most important thing he could do in that situation. And then in verse 3, he described his predicament by saying, "For strangers have risen against me. Ruthless men seek my life. They do not set God before themselves." And then there's that little word again, Selah. Think about this. Pause. I mean, this is his description of the Ziphites. Instead of strangers, some Hebrew manuscripts have a slightly different word that would mean insolent men. And so it could be either way. His point, though, is that these men had no reason to oppose him. They were being ruthlessly violent. And why? He says it there at the end, because they weren't pursuing God. They weren't seeking the Lord. So with all of that in mind, what threats are you facing? And are you trying to manage them in your own wisdom and strength? Or do you truly believe that God's mighty power is the answer? Are you convinced that prayer is the most important thing that you can do in any situation, in any trial? Do you cry out to God with that sense of desperation that we hear from David here? Ask God to show his glory, to exalt his name by coming to your rescue. The second step that we see in David's prayer is to trust in God's character. Greek mythology tells the story of Atlas. He was a titan condemned to hold up the celestial heavens for eternity after losing a battle with the gods of Olympus. Other ancient religions have similar ideas. They talk about mythical creatures carrying the earth on their backs. And as foolish as those tales seem to us, they were attempts to explain the physical world. Now, I think modern science has better explanations than that. But neither mythology nor science provides any help, really, for the struggles of the soul. And so the Bible presents God as someone who is not just distant off holding things up, but who's actively involved in the affairs of daily life. And so when we feel threatened, we can ask for his help and then trust in his character. David expressed this confidence in Psalm 54:4 by saying, "Behold, God is my helper. The Lord is the upholder of my life." See, these are his fundamental convictions about God. God created the heavens and the earth by his infinite power, but he's not just some capricious dictator. He exists outside of time and space as we know it, but he's not distant from us. He's not indifferent. He graciously condescends to listen to his people and to address the individual concerns of our lives. And when you contrast that with false religion, false gods have never been described as helpers. I mean, instead, religious leaders use them to oppress people and to keep people in line. The God of the Bible comes to us as a servant. I mean, he's first described as a helper by the patriarch Jacob back in Genesis 49:25. But the Psalms refer to him this way 17 times. Isaiah also highlights this attribute of God in passages like Isaiah 41:13, where God declares, "For I, the Lord your God, hold your right hand. It is I who say to you, fear not. I am the one who helps you. That is our God. And of course, one of the most powerful revelations of God as our helper is seen in Jesus Christ. Because you know his story. He entered our fallen world by becoming human. He showed compassion for society's outcasts. He fed the hungry. He healed the sick. In Mark 10:45, it tells us that he said, for even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. And we know Philippians 2:8, Paul says he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. I mean, that's our servant Savior who comes to our aid, who comes to rescue us and help us. And so David has the same concept of God here in Psalm 54. But he also speaks of God there as the upholder of his life. So God's help is not limited to just an occasional intervention when things happen to get out of hand. He continually sustains and protects. And this is true on every level. In the natural world, Jesus taught that God is the one who by his power and his design causes the sun to rise and the rain to fall. On a physical level, he's the one who keeps us breathing and our hearts beating. Job 34:14-15 acknowledges that idea when it says, if he should set his heart to it and gather to himself his spirit and his breath, all flesh would perish together and man would return to dust. So God upholds us physically, but he also upholds us on a spiritual level. And David acknowledged that God's protection provides peace even when we are threatened. Back in Psalm 3, it's a psalm that was written later on in David's life when his son Absalom had led a rebellion against him. And David was forced to flee out into the wilderness again, just like in his youth. But in verses 5 and 6 of that psalm, he says, even though all of that was going on in his life, I lay down and slept. I woke again, for the Lord sustained me. I will not be afraid of many thousands of people who have set themselves against me all around. So that's what we're talking about. God's always there, sustaining, upholding. Now, as we continue in Psalm 54, we find that David also trusted in God's faithful justice. In verse 5, he says, he will return the evil to my enemies. In your faithfulness, put an end to them. Now, as we saw previously in Psalms 52 and 53, David realized that the evil deeds that people do deeply offend God because justice is an integral part of his character. And so the Lord will be faithful to who he's revealed himself to be. And so David chose to trust in God's judgment. He believed that the Lord would deal with Saul and these people, the Ziphites. Their evil would not go unpunished. So, do you understand the character of God? Do you see him as both your Lord and Creator, but also your helper, your sustainer? Do you realize that you're only alive right now because he is sustaining you? He's keeping your heart beating. And so when you're threatened, you can trust him. If any harm should come to you, he will bring ultimate justice. And that leads us to a third step we see in this psalm, and it is to always give thanks. I think most of us insist on kind of paying our own way through life. It's a matter of personal pride, of independence. We work hard to earn an income, and when someone even gives us a gift, we're hesitant to accept it. We feel obligated to give something in return. It's as if there's this balance that we want to maintain. And that mindset seeps into our approach to God. Some people foolishly attempt to earn a right standing with God by giving money or participating in religious rituals. And even among those of us who understand that salvation is by grace through faith, we can still fall into treating worship and obedience as some sort of bribe. If I do enough, then God will be obligated to bless me. Or I could at least pay him back maybe a little bit somewhere down the road. We need to understand that we could never do anything to place God under obligation to us. He doesn't listen to us or help us because we've earned it. The Bible's clear that because of our countless sins, we deserve to receive his condemnation for eternity. And so every blessing we receive from God is an expression of his grace. And every prayer then should involve thanksgiving. Now, remember, Psalm 54, like we've been seeing, was written from the perspective of David's present threats from the Ziphites and from Saul. But as he concluded his prayer, he looked to the future and to the past. In verse 6, he said, "With a free will offering, I will sacrifice to you. I will give thanks to your name, O Lord, for it is good." The Old Testament law required the people of Israel to offer God a variety of different sacrifices at various seasons of the year. But a free will offering was something extra, something that was beyond what was commanded. It was an expression of pure gratitude, initiated purely from the heart of the worshiper. And so as David was fleeing for his life, he pledged to offer this future sacrifice. Now, he was not offering a bribe. He wasn't trying to strike a deal with God. He never said, "God, I will offer this sacrifice if you save me, or if you strike down Saul, or if you punish the Ziphites." He simply pledged himself to give thanks because of the unchanging goodness of God's name. It was all based on God's character, like we talked about a moment ago. David understood that God always deserves to receive worship and praise and thanks, regardless of the present circumstances in our lives. And we see here something similar over in the New Testament. Paul emphasized this point for New Testament believers in 1 Thessalonians 5:16-18 by saying, "Rejoice always, pray without ceasing, give thanks in all circumstances, for this is the will of God in Christ Jesus for you." Now, of course, we as New Testament believers do not offer animal sacrifices like they did in the Old Testament. And so Hebrews 13, verses 15-16, guides us in expressing our thanks to God. It speaks of Christ and says, "Through him, then, let us continually offer up a sacrifice of praise to God that is the fruit of lips that acknowledge his name. Do not neglect to do good and to share what you have, for such sacrifices are pleasing to God." So gratitude should shape our words. We should acknowledge and praise the glorious name of God. But gratitude should also shape our deeds, our actions, our relationships with people. It should drive us to find needs to meet and ways to share. So in addition to looking ahead and making that pledge, David also looked back to the past in his thanksgiving. As he concluded Psalm 54 in verse 7, he said, "For he has delivered me from every trouble, and my eye has looked in triumph on my enemies." See, whenever David was in danger, any time in his life, he talks about his youth as a shepherd boy and dealing with lions and bears that were attacking the flock. Through everything, God was protecting him. He understood that. Whenever he faced trials, difficulties, or heartaches, it was the Lord who helped him overcome. Every accomplishment, every victory was only possible by God's strength. And so David realizes that he cannot claim any credit for any good thing that ever happened in his life. He can only give thanks. So is that your perspective? Are you committed to giving thanks to God consistently in the future, right now, regardless of the trials or threats that you're facing? Do you really see every good thing from your life throughout your life as His doing? Is your life characterized by consistent gratitude to Him? If so, then praise His name and share with those in need. So we face a variety of threats throughout our lives. Very different from what David did, but threats nonetheless. And Psalm 54 gives us the basic steps for how to respond. We must ask for God's help, trust in His character, and always give thanks. Now, much more could be said, but we'll delve deeper into some of these ideas as we study other Psalms from this period in David's life. Now, David spoke of this relationship with God in very personal terms. And so I have to ask, do you have a personal relationship with God like that? If not, I encourage you to start today. Recognize that He is your helper, that He's upheld your life from the moment you were conceived. Now, you've sinned against Him time and again, but He sent His Son to die for your sins and to rise from the dead so that you could be saved from the condemnation that you deserve. And so He's worthy of our thanks. He's worthy of your trust. He's worthy of your worship and your obedience. Draw near to Him today. And if you're looking for a description of what that kind of worshipful life looks like, I'd encourage you to take some time and read through Romans chapter 12 there in the New Testament. It's a great description. Now, if you're already a believer, how are you responding to those times when you feel threatened? Do you lash out? Do you try to take control verbally or physically? Or do you follow these steps that we've talked about? Is there one of them that you really need to focus on? Asking God? Or are you just too independent? Trusting in Him? Being thankful? I want to encourage you to work at keeping that focus this week. The other question I need to ask is, do you know someone else who feels threatened by something? It might be something that seems harmless to you, but for them, it's still a major struggle. Would you reflect the compassion of God in how you listen to that person? Would you pray for them and pray with them? Would you encourage them to trust God as their helper? May God's name receive all glory.